Hi, thanks for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. And now we're going to go on with the series of videos on Plato's Republic. So we're at the second half now of Book 9. We've already gone through all 5 constitutions, and we saw towards the end of last week's video that they declared that the tyrant was the least happy and the least healthy, and the aristocrat was the healthiest. Well, now Socrates is going to take it a step further and say that there is someone even more wretched than the person with the tyrannical nature. And all of our translations, as I've been doing throughout the Republic, are by Paul Shorey. So Socrates says, "Perhaps you will regard the one I'm about to name is still more wretched." What one is that? The one who, being of tyrannical temper, does not live out his life in private station, but is so unfortunate that by some unhappy chance he is enabled to become an actual tyrant. I infer from what has already been said that you speak truly. Yes, but it is not enough to suppose such things. We must examine thoroughly by reason and an argument such as this. For our inquiry concerns the greatest of all things, the good life or the bad life. And so from here, Socrates is going to launch into 3 different proofs to show that the actual tyrant is the most wretched. Now, the first proof, I'll grant you, has not aged very well, but we'll still just take a quick look at it, that Socrates compares the tyrant to a wealthy private citizen who owns many slaves. And to give you some flavor of his argument, here's one quote. "Now suppose some god should catch up a man who has 50 or more slaves and waft him with his wife and children away from the city and set him down with his other possessions and his slaves in a solitude where no free man could come to his rescue. What and how great would be his fare, do you suppose, lest he and his wife and children be destroyed by the slaves? Now suppose that God established round about him numerous neighbors who would not tolerate the claim of one man to be master of another, but would inflict the utmost penalties on any such person on whom they could lay their hands." And now Glaucon has come into the conversation. He says, "I think that his plight would be still more desperate, encompassed by nothing but enemies. And does not such a harvest of ills measure the difference between the man who is merely ill-governed in his own soul, the man of tyrannical temper, whom you just now judged to be most miserable, and the man who, having this disposition, does not live out his life in private station, but is constrained by some ill hap to become an actual tyrant, and while unable to control himself, attempts to rule over others, as if a man with a sick and incontinent body should not live the private life, but should be compelled to pass his days in contention and strife with other persons." So that's the first argument here. So then Socrates says of the tyrannical nature that so far from finding even the least satisfaction for his desires, he is in need of most things and is a poor man in very truth, as is apparent if one knows how to observe a soul in its entirety. So when we look at the tyrant, maybe if you're just looking on the surface, you think this is the luckiest person on earth. They have everything, power, money, respect of those around them. But actually that person is very poor and in need of most things. And then they declare the victory here. So Socrates says, "Shall we hire a herald then, or shall I myself make proclamation that the son of Ariston," meaning Glaucon, "pronounced the best man and the most righteous to be the happiest, and that he is the one who is the most kingly and a king over himself, and declares that the most evil and most unjust is the most unhappy, who again is the person who, having the most of the tyrannical temper in himself, becomes most of a tyrant over himself and over the state. let it have been so proclaimed by you. And so now we move on to proof number 2, where Socrates matches the 3 parts of the soul to their corresponding desires. This then would be one of our proofs, but examine the second one and see if there is anything in it. Since, corresponding to the 3 types in the city, the soul also is tripartite, it will admit, I think, of another demonstration also. What is that? The following. The 3 parts have also, it appears to me, 3 kinds of pleasure, one peculiar to each, and similarly 3 appetites and controls. And so first Socrates is going to summarize the 3 parts of the soul. One part, we say, is that with which a man learns. One is that with which he feels anger. But the third part, owing to its manifold forms, we could not easily designate by any one distinctive name, but gave it the name of its chief and strongest element. For we called it the appetitive part, because of the intensity of its appetites, concerned with food and drink and love and their accompaniments. And likewise the money-loving part, because money is the chief instrument for the gratification of such desires. And so just briefly to give you the visual, here is the tripartite soul. Remember the logos on top of the reasoning part. The thumos is the angry part or the high-spirited part. And the epithumia, the appetitive part. So now that we have the 3 parts, we're going to assign what pleasures are central to each one. And he's going to start at the bottom of the pyramid with the epithumia. If we should also say that its pleasure and its love were for gain or profit, should we not thus best bring it together under one head in our discourse, so as to understand each other when we speak of this part of the soul, and justify our calling it the money-loving and gain-loving part? Then looking at the thumos, and again of the high-spirited element, do we not say that it is wholly set on predominance and victory in good repute? Yes, indeed. And might we not appropriately designate it as the ambitious part, and that which is covetous of honor? Most appropriately. And finally the logos. But surely it is obvious to everyone that all the endeavor of the art by which we learn is ever toward knowledge of the truth of things, and that at least of the 3 is concerned for wealth and reputation, much the least. Lover of learning and lover of wisdom would be suitable designations for that, and quite so. So here we'll just put it all together. You can see the 3 parts of the soul, and then their corresponding pleasures. So money and gain are the pleasures of the appetitive part, ambition and honor are the pleasures of the high-spirited part, and knowledge and wisdom are the pleasures of the reasoning part. Now Socrates goes on, is it not also true that the ruling principle of men's souls is in some cases this faculty, meaning the logos he was referring to in this quote, and in others one of the other 2, as it may happen? So some people are ruled by the reasoning part, some are ruled by the appetitive part, some by the high-spirited part. Are you aware then that if you should choose to ask men of these 3 classes, each in turn, which is the most pleasurable of those lives, each will chiefly commend his own? Okay, reasonable enough. So they have to come up with some way to measure. Since then there is contention between the several types of pleasure and the lives themselves, not merely as to which is the more honorable or the more base or the worse or the better, but which is actually the more pleasurable or free from pain. How could we determine which of them speaks most truly? So this idea of being actually more pleasurable or free from pain, it's going to carry us into proof number 3. So we want to just hold on to that idea. But going on for now, Glaucon says that he cannot tell. Well, consider it thus. By what are things to be judged, if they're to be judged rightly? Is it not by experience, intelligence, and discussion? Or could anyone name a better criterion than these? So these are the three things that they're going to be looking at. Experience, intelligence, and the Greek word here is phronesis, which is significant because intelligence has a much broader, the colloquial use of the word intelligence has a much broader use, and a lot of people in all three categories are intelligent. But phronesis in particular is that power in the soul that allows us to function at that higher power of knowing, to function in the outer world. It's what allows us to participate in nous and therefore experience the upper realm of the cave allegory, or the intelligible realm. And that will be significant as we go on. So three things: experience, phronesis, and discussion. So first they're going to look at experience. And they're going to start with the lover of gain, and then they'll talk about the lover of honor. So first, the philosopher must needs taste of the other two kinds of pleasure from childhood. But the lover of gain is not only under no necessity of tasting or experiencing the sweetness of the pleasure of learning the true natures of things, the upper world, but he cannot easily do so even if he desires and is eager for it. The lover of wisdom, then, far surpasses the lover of gain in experience of both kinds of pleasure. And then going on to the lover of honor, how does he compare with the lover of honor? Is he more unacquainted with the pleasure of being honored than that other with which comes from knowledge? Nay, honor, if they achieve their several objects, attends them all. For the rich man is honored by many, and the brave man and the wise, so that all are acquainted with the kind of pleasure that honor brings. But it is impossible for anyone, except the lover of wisdom, to have savored the delights that is the contemplation of true being and reality. Then, so far as experience goes, he, the philosopher, is the best judge of the three. Now, going on to phronesis, this is actually very short. I think many people might even miss it. It's really only one sentence. But if you understand what phronesis is, you realize that this is really all Socrates has to say. That the philosopher is the only one whose experience will have been accompanied by phronesis. And intelligence here again is phronesis. And so what he's saying is essentially that life in the cave, the pleasures in the experiences in the cave are not accompanied by phronesis. Only that person who can go to the upper world or to experience the absolute realities, to know things in themselves, has experience that is accompanied by phronesis. And so as far as he's concerned, that whole argument is done, and he goes on to discussion. And yet again, that which is the instrument of judgment is the instrument not of the lover of gain or of the lover of honor, but of the lover of wisdom. What is that? It was by means of words and discussion that we said the judgment must be reached, was it not? Yes. And they are the instrument mainly of the philosopher, of course. And so the kind of discussion they're referring to here, of course, is the kind of discussion that Socrates most enjoyed engaging in dialectic in the more formal sense. And that brings us into proof number 3. Now, proof number 2 didn't actually argue that the actual tyrant was the worst. We really have to carry that argument, I think, into number 3 to get the conclusion. And here Socrates describes the movement from pleasure to pain and from pain to pleasure. Now for the third in the Olympian fashion to the Savior and to Olympian Zeus. Observe that other pleasure than that of the intelligence, phronesis, is not altogether even real or pure, but is a kind of scene painting, as I seem to have heard from some wise man. And yet this would be the greatest and most decisive overthrow. So basically he's saying here that only the pleasure in the upper world or in the intelligible realm is real, and the pleasures in the cave are not even real. They're more just like images. So let's go on to see how he does this. So he sets up pleasure and pain. First, they're seen as opposites to one another. But we can also imagine a neutral state that is somewhere in between. Now, if a person experiences great pain and they go through a period of great pain, then once it finally lifts, they may raise up to this neutral. But compared to the pain they felt, they perceive it as pleasure. And then likewise, a person who experiences great pleasure and experiences it for some time may, once they come down from that high, return to this neutral. And the neutral position, again, it's not actually pain, but compared to that high that they felt when they were in pleasure, it seems like pain. And so this neutral position is neither pain nor pleasure, but it can be perceived sometimes as pain, sometimes as pleasure. Therefore, it's an illusion. If then to be filled with what befits nature is pleasure, then that which is more really filled with real things, absolute realities, would more really and truly cause us to enjoy a true pleasure, while that which partakes of the less truly existent would be less truly and surely filled, and would partake of a less trustworthy and less true pleasure. So first he's going to talk about the appetitive, people who function at the appetitive element. And those who have no experience of phronesis, and here phronesis, this time Shori translated it as wisdom. Before it was intelligence, but the Greek word is the same. Those who have no experience of phronesis and virtue, or orete, but are ever devoted to feastings and that sort of thing, are swept downward, it seems, and back again to the center, and so sway and roam to and fro throughout their lives. But they've never transcended all this and turned their eyes to the true upper region, nor been wafted there, nor ever been really filled with real things, nor ever tasted stable and pure pleasure, but with eyes ever bent upon the earth and heads bowed ever greedy for more of these delights, and in their greed kicking and butting one another with horns and hoofs of iron, they slay one another in sateless avidity, because they are vainly striving to satisfy with things that are not real the unreal and continent part of their souls. So nice imagery there, right? Now he's going to go on to talk about those who function at the high-spirited element. So again, must not the like hold of the high-spirited element? Whenever a man succeeds in satisfying that part of his nature, his covetousness of honor by envy, his love of victory by violence, his ill temper by indulgence in anger, pursuing these ends without regard to consideration and reason, and Glaucon agrees that the same sort of thing must necessarily happen in this case too. Then when the entire soul accepts the guidance of the wisdom-loving part and is filled with inner dissension, the result for each part is that in all other respects keeps to its own task and is just, and likewise that each enjoys its own proper pleasures and the best pleasures, and, so far as such a thing is possible, the truest. Precisely so. And so, when one of the other two gets the mastery, the result for it is that it does not find its own proper pleasure, and constrains the others to pursue an alien pleasure, and not the true. That is so. And would not that which is furthest removed from philosophy and reason be most likely to produce this effect? Quite so. Then the tyrant's place, I think, will be fixed at the furthest remove from the true and proper pleasure, and the kings or the aristocrats at the least, necessarily. Then the tyrant's life will be the least pleasurable, and the king's the most. There is every necessity of that. And then Socrates arranges the five in this order, and giving a certain math equation, he concludes that the true aristocrat is 729 times happier than the tyrant, the actual tyrant, not just the person with the tyrannical nature, but the actual tyrant. And he says, then if in point of pleasure, the victory of the good and just man over the bad and unjust is so great as this, he will surpass him inconceivably in decency and beauty of life and virtue. He will rather keep his eyes fixed on the constitution in his soul, and taking care and watching lest he disturb anything there, either by excess or deficiency of wealth, will so steer his course and add to or detract from his wealth on this principle, so far as may be. So saying that you want moderation in the appetitive part of the soul. And then he goes on to talk about also the high-spirited part. We need moderation there as well. He says in the matter of honors and office too, this will be his guiding principle. He will gladly take part in and enjoy those which he thinks will make him a better man. But in public and private life, he will shun those that may overthrow the established habit of his soul. So then Glaucon comes to this conclusion. If that is his chief concern, he will not willingly take part in politics. But then Socrates shoots back. Yes, by the dog, in his own city he certainly will, yet perhaps not in the city of his birth, except in some providential conjuncture. And remember the idea of the philosopher becoming ruler or the ruler becoming philosopher. And Glaucon says, I understand, Socrates. You mean the city whose establishment we have described, the city whose home is the Logos, for I think that it can be found nowhere on earth. Well, perhaps there is a pattern of the Greek word of paradigm. There's a pattern of it laid up in the heaven for him who wishes to contemplate it, and so beholding to constitute himself its citizen. But it makes no difference whether it exists now or ever will come into being. The politics of this city only will be his and of none other. And so there again, Socrates is going to end this part of the discussion, or Plato actually ended Book 9, by pointing out to us again that the Republic is not a political dialogue, at least not mainly. That's just secondary to it. The real city that they care about is this one in the soul that we contemplate by holding in a pattern in our soul of the absolute realities. And so that brings us to the end of Book 9, and I would love to hear your thoughts on what you've seen so far, and also if you enjoy what you're seeing, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Any questions or comments, leave them below or drop me an email. Next week, we're going to go on to Book 10. It is the last book, and we're going to start off by looking at imitation again, because Socrates is going to return to the idea of kicking out the poets. Only now we have so much more information to work with that he can talk about it in a little more detail. So he's going to return to that topic, and that's what I'm going to talk about next week. And I do hope you'll join me. Thank you so much.